We turn our attention to the Gaza Strip, where according to new leaks via US intelligence, the Hamas organization has swelled its ranks with new recruits since the start of the Israel-Hamas war in late 2023. Despite the group's loss of an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 fighters in that time, US congressional sources speaking to Reuters indicate that per American intel, Hamas has managed to recruit enough fighters to completely make up the gap, and perhaps even more. The sources interviewed in the Reuters report, apparently briefed on US intelligence during the closing weeks of the Biden administration, indicate a massive swell of new personnel for Hamas. That's 10,000 at the low end, 15,000 on the high end, roughly matching the number of Hamas fighters estimated to have been killed across 15 months of fighting. Those Hamas fatality estimates, by the way, are new information in the public domain, and for those interested in measuring against the overall death toll of Palestinians in Gaza, the highest estimate of 15,000 would equate to about one-third of all deaths counted by the Gaza Health Ministry, a Hamas subordinate. Israel, by contrast, claims that about 17,000 militants have been killed across all anti-Israel fighting organizations in Gaza. For more discussion of casualty numbers, do check out our January 17th episode of The Situation Room after we finished here, of course. Now, the new figures on Hamas recruitment have yet to be verified by either Hamas or the Israeli government, although both parties have indicated that Hamas has indeed swelled its ranks with at least several thousand fighters overall. But for Hamas recruitment during the heat of war to rival or even eclipse their total losses is essentially a new claim, and for that claim to come from Israel's closest ally rather than from Hamas or an affiliate does speak volumes. Not only that, but the numbers track with more recent observations out of the Gaza Strip, where after the ceasefire with Israel went into effect, Hamas fighters have returned to the streets in uniform in large numbers and reasserted control. Their return came as clear confirmation that despite Israel's war aims, the nation has utterly failed to break Hamas's grip on Gaza. The idea that Hamas would be able to recruit so many young Palestinians to their cause validates a concern that opponents of Israel's all-out offensive in Gaza had warned about since before the offensive began. That concern is the prospect of rapid and profound radicalization among Gazans, particularly the young men who are the targets for Hamas recruitment. Frankly, it's not difficult to understand why the situation on the grounds might lead young Gazans to radicalize. A person can debate casualty numbers all they like, but the truth of the matter is that Israel has inflicted large-scale civilian casualties in Gaza, frequently targeting homes, schools, hospitals, and places of worship, and they've displaced nearly the entire population at least once and ran a combined air and ground campaign that sowed terror across the Gaza Strip for over a year. As difficult as it may be, we're going to ask you, our audience, to engage in a thought exercise right now. If you're a young Gazan living inside Israel's offensive, what's easier? Do you look at the loss, death, and devastation delivered upon your community and believe that this is a just act carried out by a nation that is right to end the lives of people you grew up with and force your parents and loved ones to abandon their homes or way of life? Or do you think you become embittered against the people who've chosen to impact your community in this way? Unfortunately, we're talking about an environment where Hamas and other militant terror organizations have exercised authoritarian control for a generation, and where there is both no way to escape and no way to take part in non-violent or less violent forms of resistance. That's why experts on radicalization have been sounding the alarm since the start of the war, that it will likely be a radicalizing influence on a generation of young people. Their choices, if they'd like to take action, are either to side with the people bombing their homes or to side with Hamas, who've deliberately made themselves into the only alternative, helped along by Israel's refusal to allow non-Hamas Palestinian leadership to establish itself in Gaza. It's worth emphasizing here that even if at the high end of the US estimate, 15,000 young men really did join Hamas, that still leaves a far greater number of young men who haven't. There are about 300,000 Gazan men between the ages of 15 and 30, and the fact that lots of these young men are being radicalized does not mean that everyone is being radicalized to the point that they take violent action. But even if we're talking about a relatively small share of the Gaza population here, 15,000 new Hamas recruits is still a massive problem for Israel, especially if that same number is enough to basically refill the ranks of Hamas. But where Israel is concerned, it's worth taking a moment to really make sense of what those numbers mean, because they are a problem. They're a massive problem, but they're not necessarily a problem for today. And they might not be the sort of problem where an immediate, sweeping Israeli response would be worth breaking the fragile ceasefire that Israel and Hamas have established. Now, those two realities may not seem like they can square with each other, but in fact, they can coexist quite well, because while Hamas's new recruits ensure that their organization isn't on the brink of collapse, they don't fix the immediate problems that Hamas faces. To explain why, imagine that you've got a regiment of 4,000 soldiers loyal to an army of your choice. They form a well-managed organization with clear leadership, lots of expertise on whatever general task is entrusted to it, and an internal infrastructure that's been working since before any of the regiment's current members arrived and will keep on doing so after they've all left. Now take the soldiers in that regiment and replace them with 4,000 privates who've all just finished basic training. See how much gets done? For Hamas, it's a similar story. Israel's offensive has killed thousands of fighters, including many of the ones who are high-level leaders, large and small unit commanders, and specialist experts in a given area. That expertise and experience is gone. But the numbers have been replenished, if not even refilled, even if those numbers aren't worth as much without the organization and the leadership of members who've long since perished. That shift in the organization is further evidenced by the choices and movements of Hamas fighters now that they've re-emerged. While some have moved into defensible positions and others seem to have gotten to work rebuilding Hamas infrastructure that Israel's destroyed, thousands upon thousands of them have begun to work on much simpler tasks, donning masks, grabbing weapons, and patrolling the streets in numbers we could probably describe as overkill, while others have pivoted to work on the distribution of humanitarian aid. These are not particularly difficult jobs, so far as Hamas is concerned. The high number of uniformed Hamas participants in both may reflect large numbers of newer members who aren't yet ready to be entrusted with greater responsibilities. According to other sources on the ground interviewed by Western media, Hamas police have been living for months among the population of Gaza's displaced people, out of uniform, and sometimes working through offices in hospitals and other civilian locations. The rush of new Hamas recruits, even before the implementation of a ceasefire, is already discouraging enough for Israel, but it may not be the end of the story. According to some experts on the conflict, Hamas was already heading into the ceasefire riding high on public belief that Hamas had functionally attained victory. These feelings have probably been reinforced, in turn, by the re-emergence of such a strong Hamas presence after Israel agreed to stop the active combat. As one Israeli expert on Palestinian affairs, Michael Milstein, explained it to the Associated Press, quote, "The war is ending with a strong perception of success for Hamas. The enlistment capabilities will be crazy. They won't be able to handle it." That is to say, it's entirely possible that the 10,000 to 15,000 new recruits Hamas collected in wartime could be far eclipsed by the number of new recruits they'll gather up in peacetime. For Israel, as we've expressed previously, this is less of a short-term problem and more of a long-term one. For Hamas to simply shove Kalashnikovs into the hands of 10,000 novice recruits who haven't had the freedom or local peace required to do any kind of formal training during the last 15 months and send them to attack Israel, well, they'd certainly do some damage. But what Hamas would stand to gain by training those recruits and using them to rebuild its organization to its pre-2023 strength would almost certainly be more valuable than just expending the new recruits it has. From Israel's perspective, however, that's a difficult quandary to deal with. Israel can respond preemptively, trying to dismantle and snuff out the organization. But we now know that Israel's approach hasn't been nearly so effective across the last 15 months. It's a tough ask for Israel to be more effective in a second go-around without engaging in an even more total offensive in Gaza. But with a ceasefire now in effect, there's little appetite in Israel for such a thing. But leave Hamas alone for now, let them elevate new leaders and train thousands of fighters, and potentially even receive a new groundswell of support now that the ceasefire is in effect. Well, it's putting off today's problem and creating tomorrow's nightmare. Nor is there an easy way to de-radicalize these new Hamas recruits, to cajole or coerce them out of the organization, or to divert the even greater swell of recruits that might be on their way. Israel has long stood in the way of worldwide attempts to develop alternatives to Hamas within Gaza in what's been condemned for years as a short-sighted, even foolhardy approach. Simply insisting that young Gazans refuse to join Hamas while ensuring that there is no alternative to Hamas is not a strategy that ever had a clear path to success. In the context of this war, however, it's turned into a complete lack of realistic options to manage the day after the war. And at least on a temporary basis, we're now in the territory best described as the day after. The result hasn't just been the entirely predictable re-emergence of Hamas back into the leadership void that Israel's taken no steps to remedy. Instead, we've got that and the emergence of thousands upon thousands of new fighters with more on the way. Israel has made clear that it would resume its war against Hamas at the end of the current 6-week ceasefire if Hamas doesn't maintain a complete ceasefire, releases hostages as expected, and allow the distribution of aid into Gaza neighborhoods. Hamas has insisted that it won't release many of its hostages until and unless Israel agrees to a permanent ceasefire and completely withdraws from Gaza. Already, that was going to be a very, very challenging balance to achieve, even without factoring in the possibility that the ceasefire could lapse after 6 weeks or be broken in a sudden surge of violence. But now, with Hamas emboldened and reinforced, there's even more reason for Israel's leaders to consider a return to open hostilities. Hamas, by contrast, has every incentive to reach a permanent ceasefire and build back even stronger. But they also have reason to believe that they could survive brief or limited military actions by Israel, and they have reason to doubt that the Israeli government could get away with a full-scale return to hostilities, both due to pressure at home and pressure from abroad, to maintain and extend this temporary truce. It's a delicate moment on both sides, without any clear path that leads toward a real, long-term resolution and doesn't eventually turn back in the direction of war. In the normal course of things, a former police officer announcing he's launching a political party would barely be worth a two-line item on the news. But then, most former police officers aren't Jimmy Chirazier, a Haitian gang leader and warlord better known by his alias of Barbecue. On January 1st this year, Chirazier announced that the gang coalition he leads, Viv Ansam, was going to become a political party. By this, he didn't mean that it was going to down arms, renounce violence, and try to effect social change via the ballot box. Instead, the announcement seemed to signify something much bigger, a desire by Barbecue to force his way into Haiti's ruling class. For anyone with even the slightest knowledge of Haiti's situation, such a concept likely sounds like parody. After all, Viv Ansam is among the most brutal of the armed groups that have paralyzed the Caribbean nation, collapsing its government last March and effectively placing most of the capital, Port-au-Prince, under a state of occupation. An occupation that has triggered one of the Western Hemisphere's worst humanitarian crises. Here are some figures. Last year, Haiti's gangs killed over 5,600 people. As the Small Wars Journal writes, quoting here, this is equivalent to an annual homicide rate of almost 48 per 100,000 inhabitants, a national record. Let's put that in perspective. A murder rate of 45 per 100,000 was enough for Ecuador last year to declare itself in a state of internal armed conflict. Not only has Haiti exceeded that grim milestone, but it has also seen over 1 million of its citizens displaced by violence. So bad has the anarchy gotten that the UK's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, James Kariuki, recently noted that, quoting here, at least one Haitian was killed, kidnapped, or injured every hour as a result of gang violence in 2024. As the leader of Viv Ansam, Chirazier has been a key driver of these horrors, which is why the reaction to his political ambitions was so remarkable. Rather than a united show of defiance, some of Haiti's elites seemed cautiously okay with gangs entering the political sphere. On January the 10th, PHTK party leader and member of Haiti's 9-member Transitional Presidential Council, Lingué Balthazar, went on Magic 9 Radio, where he suggested the council was in active negotiations with Viv Ansam. As Inside Crime writes, Balthazar implied, quote, that Viv Ansam is involved in discussions over the council's future alongside major political players. Balthazar also suggested his party was open to an alliance with the gangs ahead of Haiti's next elections, which should take place in early 2026. Defending his views, he claimed that, quoting again, we must stop this hypocrisy. There is a phenomenon of illegal armed groups in the country, and we must, as adults and pragmatists, solve this problem. To say this caused a backlash would be a little like saying DeepSeek AI made a tiny bit of a splash this week. Although he's long tried to paint himself as a political figure, often comparing himself to Che Guevara and declaring he's leading a revolution, most of Haitian society sees Barbecue as a mass murderer responsible for untold suffering. Speaking to the Miami Herald, a lawyer for the December 21st Agreement movement, also represented on the Transitional Council, declared of Viv Ansam, there is no place at the negotiating table. They are criminals and should be destroyed. Others pointed to the known connections between the PHTK party and Haiti's armed groups to explain away Balthazar's bizarre statement. Yet for all the rage, it seems clear that at least some of the elites are already preparing for gangs to become recognized political players. A recent proposal submitted by several key parties to the Caribbean community, CARICOM, for reforming the Transitional Council even included a mention of which reform would be most acceptable to Viv Ansam. All of which raises some fascinating, disturbing questions, not least among them being, what would it mean if a gang that helps bring Haiti to its knees wound up determining its future? Even in the annals of gang and cartel crime, such an outcome would be unusual. For all the damage they've done, and all the politicians and judges they've corrupted, gangs in Ecuador and Mexico are a long way from helping to decide the shape of government. The cynical retort would be that in Haiti's case, gangs are already doing a lot of the governing. As the Global Initiative NGO wrote in a recent report, so much of Port-au-Prince is now a no-go zone to the Haitian state that, quoting them, gang leaders operate as judges and advisors in their fiefdoms, settling disputes and conflicts and enforcing law and order. Now, seen through the lens of realpolitik, acknowledging that Viv Ansam and others will play a role in Haiti's future is simply working with the reality on the ground. The reality the Haitian state is too weak and corrupted to change, even with outside backing. Hence why many Caribbean leaders who helped set up the Transitional Presidential Council last year argued for including guys like Barbecue, an idea that was vetoed by the US and France. The counter-argument is that there has been nothing inevitable about Haiti's increasing slide into chaos. Instead of being due to the strength of gangs, blame can instead be laid at an elite so corrupt they'd make the fabled DC swamp look like a sun-dappled oasis. When the US and CARICOM helped set the Transitional Council up in April 2024, its tasks were clear: prepare for much-delayed elections while also supporting the Kenyan-led multinational security support mission designed to defeat the gangs. Instead, the 9-member council spent the intervening months getting in a fight with the interim prime minister and lining their own pockets. According to the Miami Herald, 3 of the council's members used their newfound positions to try and extort $758,000 from the chairman of the National Bank of Credit. When confronted by the country's anti-corruption unit, the 3 refused to resign or answer the summons of a judge. The result has been a council too paralyzed by infighting to get any work done, and a corruption case that has dynamited its legitimacy in the eyes of most Haitians. At the same time, the Kenyan-led mission has failed to make much of a dent in the gang's hold on territory. Initially meant to comprise 2,500 officers, the intervention still boasts only about 800 men after many countries that pledged assistance failed to follow through on their promises. It is also chronically underfunded, with a shortfall of maybe $500 million and equipment that often breaks down and isn't designed for urban combat. Again, this was not inevitable. It is entirely possible that in some parallel universe where the intervention deployed in force and the Transitional Council acted in the public interest, we're starting 2025 with Haiti slowly regaining some security and stability. Sadly, though, that ain't our universe. And in our universe, the failures of the council and policing mission have created a scenario in which elites are openly discussing an accommodation with the gangs to halt the violence. And what violence it is. The last few months have seen a number of massacres in Haiti that are shocking even by the gang standards. There was the October attack on Pont-Sonde by the Grand Griffe armed group, which was angry at locals for defying it, an attack that cost maybe 115 lives. Then there was the December slaughter of elderly voodoo practitioners ordered by a gang leader who believed they'd caused his child to get sick. In that case, over 200 people were murdered, dismembered, and their remains dumped in the ocean. And we could go on in this vein, detailing the appalling attacks on infrastructure, such as the sacking and burning of the Bernard Mevs Critical Care Hospital, or the destruction of agricultural lands in the Artibonite that has helped push millions to the brink of starvation. We could mention, too, the expanding gang recruitment of children, a recruitment drive that recently led UNICEF to estimate that children make up half of all Haitian gang members. But time's short, and the real question is not what the gangs have already done, but whether incorporating leaders like Barbecue into Haiti's political structures will help bring stability. Honestly, pretty hard to say. While you can imagine individual gang leaders offering peace for power, Haiti's criminal landscape is so fragmented that it's hard to see how you could get them all to come on board. And powerful as Viv Ansam is, it's hardly the only armed group with the strength to paralyze the country. What seems more likely is codifying of the parasitic relationship that already exists between Haiti's elites and the armed groups they clandestinely funded, making official what was once strictly kept to the shadows. Because make no mistake here, if Haiti's gangs are able to turn themselves into legitimate political players, it would redefine what has happened in this Caribbean nation over the last few years. Rather than a descent into anarchy, the violence might come to be viewed more as a civil war, one in which the insurgents were able to force a settlement that was favorable to themselves. Regardless of the outcome, one thing's for sure: whether the gangsters join state structures or not, the suffering of ordinary Haitians seems destined to continue. Betrayed by their own political class and preyed upon by criminals, the country's civilians may now be forced to witness those responsible for their pain be rewarded for all the destruction they've caused. And now, we turn our attention to a new potential jihadist state in West Africa. When the Islamic State emerged in Syria and Iraq a decade ago, the news shook the world. The idea that a bunch of jihadists could occupy a swath of land the size of Ecuador and impose a brutal caliphate was just so left field that no one could have predicted it. Right up until the moment it emerged, turbocharging what were already two brutal civil wars, the concept would have seemed absurd, a fever dream born of paranoia. Well, fast forward nearly 11 years, and it's possible that we are again like those folk in early 2014, blissfully unaware of the scale of the jihadist threat. Only this time, it's not the Middle East, where an Islamist state could be carved out, but West Africa, specifically in the stretch of land where the savannah meets the desert, known as the Sahel. At least, that's the opinion of research fellow and analyst at the Institute for Security Studies, Oluwale Ojawale, who recently published a piece on the conversation titled, "West Africa Could Soon Have a Jihadist State." Drawing on multiple studies, as well as a similar warning article from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project that was published in September, Ojawale has a simple and terrifying theory: that the expanding local reach of groups such as IS Sahel and the Al-Qaeda affiliate JNIM could lead to a moment similar to Syria and Iraq in 2014, or as he writes, quoting, "Operating in parts of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Chad, these groups aspire to form a jihadist caliphate in the Sahel region." Obviously, that's quite a big claim to make. Doubtless, there are other analysts out there who would dispute the ability of these groups to create anything as remotely coherent as a state. Yet what makes Ojawale's argument persuasive is that he's not alone. Aside from the ACLED article back in the autumn, there has also been reporting by the Southern Center and the Critical Threats Project on the expanding territorial reach of the Sahel's jihadist groups, as well as inside reports from nations like Niger on civilians already living under IS rule. And that's not to mention a UN report, the findings of which The Economist paraphrased as, quoting here, "Regional branches of Al-Qaeda are gaining ground, threatening West African coastal states, and may establish a terrorist sanctuary." Taken all together then, it adds up to a potential warning siren. Not a guarantee that anything bad is going to happen, but an ominous signal that if things don't change course, the Sahel could soon become the epicenter of a violent new caliphate. As to why this corner of West Africa seems so vulnerable, well, there are many reasons, but they can be summed up with a single word: instability. Over the past decade, the Sahel region has gone from a bit of a backwater to one of the most violent places on Earth. In 2023, jihadists killed a record 11,643 residents, making the region the global epicenter of terrorist violence. On top of that, multiple states are caught up in civil wars. At least half of Burkina Faso's territory is under the control of armed groups, while parts of Niger have been occupied by IS Sahel. In Mali, a kaleidoscope of rebel groups battle government forces, while jihadists like JNIM stage daring attacks in the capital of Bamako. Now, if you're a follower of geopolitical news, you might recognize those three nations. It's because all three recently forged an alliance after overthrowing their governments in military coups. Often framed as anti-colonial uprisings, in each case, those coups led to the expulsion of French and American forces that had been conducting counter-terror operations and the arrival of soldiers from the former Wagner Group. In each case, the ruling generals framed their new strategic partnership with the Kremlin as a necessary step to restore stability. And in each case, the plan utterly failed. Rather than lead to the defeat of the rebels, the coups and expulsions of Western forces generally led to power vacuums. The Italian think tank Institute for International Political Studies did a good rundown of the impact this had, from giving JNIM breathing room to forge new alliances in Mali to a surge of lethal jihadist attacks in Burkina Faso. But perhaps more central to our theme today is the way that the sharp spike in violence that followed the coups allowed the jihadists to present themselves as guarantors of stability. As ACLED writes, both IS Sahel and JNIM have exploited the resulting security gaps and intensified their operations in an attempt to assert that their governance models are the only viable alternatives to the previous quasi-democratic and existing military-led regimes. This is not dissimilar to how the Taliban managed to win tacit support in parts of Afghanistan by promising a return to order from the chaos that they'd caused. But within the alliance of Sahel states, the rebels' work has been made easier by the sheer gusto with which the juntas and Wagner mercenaries have taken to killing civilians. In Burkina Faso, France 24 reports that the government's policy of total war has led to a spike in the killing of civilians, particularly those in the Fulani minority. In Mali, ordinary people have borne the brunt of the Wagner-led fightback. As journalist Wasim Nasser told the channel, the human rights abuses of Wagner and the Malian junta in the center of Mali made many Fulanis join the jihadists. At the same time, as governments have grown more abusive, the jihadist groups themselves have made an effort to moderate their images. ACLED have detailed how, since April 2023, IS Sahel has prioritized proselytizing and community outreach over violent attacks. In their words, this has been done to gain local support and consolidate the group's presence and influence in these communities. Through preaching, the group seeks to spread its ideological beliefs and gain legitimacy among the local population to consolidate its regional governance structure. Although this does sound like a cheap trick from the outside, it clearly works. Especially in northeastern Mali and parts of Niger, IS Sahel has effectively replaced the state, taking over the functions of local government even as they push an extremely harsh interpretation of Sharia law. Of course, promises of stability alone wouldn't be enough to explain the growing jihadist hold on territory, and it's here that we return to the Conversation article for more insight, because it identifies a list of risk factors in the region that are growing almost daily. A major one is entrenched poverty, combined with the population explosion. Nearly 80% of all Sahel residents live on less than $2 a day, at a time when a working-age adult in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger has an average of almost 100 dependents. That's a lot of mouths to feed. And you know what pays well? Joining a jihadist army. The Institute for War and Peace Reporting recently carried an interview with a Malian villager related to two fighters who had joined a JNIM-affiliated group. He claimed that they were paid 2 million West African francs a month, equivalent to about $3,400. While it's possible he's inflating the figures, even a pay packet a mere tenth of that size would be a fortune in rural Mali. Add to this the demographic profile of the region, a place where the median age is between 15 and 19 years, and it's easy to see why there might be a lot of disaffected young men willing to take up arms for a cause that both pays well and claims to be protecting their villages from an abusive government. In this, it's possible to see analogies, if you squint a bit, to the teens joining Haiti's gangs. In both cases, young men who feel they have nothing to lose are incentivized by a broken society to take up arms. One major difference, though, is that the jihadist groups in the Sahel have the discipline to expand their operations. As both the Conversation piece and a recent article by the Soufan Center demonstrate, the reach of these groups is now growing far beyond their base of operations. For countries bordering Burkina Faso, this is an evolving nightmare. Benin and Togo have both been shaken by attacks in their north. Côte d'Ivoire, meanwhile, is having to spend significant sums keeping its border regions safe. More troubling might be the situation in Ghana. Although the country hasn't experienced any serious attacks, the Soufan Center writes that jihadists, quote, now regularly cross into northern Ghana using the area for logistical and medical purposes. Reuters even claims that the authorities are deliberately turning a blind eye to their presence in return for the jihadists not staging attacks on Ghanaian soil. But while that may be working, it is also allowing the insurgents to potentially expand their territory into the country's north. That's not just us hypothesizing. Expanding into the coastal states of West Africa is JNIM's stated policy. In an interview with France 24, senior commander Hamadon Kofa boasted that the group was expanding into Ghana, Benin, and Togo. On the other side of the fight, US AFRICOM commander Michael Langley has warned that jihadist groups are, quote, metastasizing and moving towards the northern borders of the coastal West Africa states. And that could be very bad news, not just for West Africa, but for the wider world. After all, it was the emergence of a terrorist safe haven in Iraq and Syria last decade that led to some of the worst attacks Europe has ever experienced. Nor was America immune. While plots directed by ISIS were rare on US soil, lone wolves inspired by the group were responsible for tragedies like the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting. Were a new jihadist state to really arise in West Africa, we might expect it to function as a safe haven for those planning similar attacks. After all, Islamist plots in the US reached an all-time high during the days of the Caliphate, despite America being thousands of kilometers away from Iraq and Syria. The good news is that there's no guarantee such an outcome will happen. As the ACLED report points out, one of the major limiting factors on JNIM and IS Sahel expanding their territory is ongoing war between the two groups. One which drains their resources, kills their fighters, and so far keeps either from focusing on territorial growth. Still, the mere fact that a new caliphate in West Africa is even a remote possibility should set off alarm bells. In far too many ways, the Sahel region and the conflicts in Burkina Faso and Mali are overlooked by the wider world. Hopefully, this segment has shown why they deserve our attention. Thank you for watching.